How did the most hated band by critics become the most beloved band in America? And who was behind the miracle? A marketing genius, a dictator, or both? His name was Terry Knight, the architect of Grand Funk Railroad. But here's the biggest mystery. How could a partnership that created an empire end in a mutually destructive war? Was it a classic tale of greed and betrayal? Or was it the inevitable tragedy of one man trying to own a hurricane? And finally, did the conflict ever really end? Or did the battlefield simply shift from the courtroom to the blood-soaked floor of his own apartment? Terry Knight, born Richard Terrence Knapp on April 9, 1943, in Lapeer, a small town just outside the gritty industrial heartland of Flint, Michigan. In the post-war boom years, Flint wasn't just a city. It was an idea. It was the vehicle city, the birthplace and beating heart of General Motors, a place where the American dream was assembled piece by piece on the relentless rhythm of the production line. Life was defined by hard work, union wages, shift changes, and the promise, however fragile, of a stable, secure middle-class existence built on factory labor. Richard Knapp was born directly into this world. His family was solid working-class stock. His father worked for GM, a loyal employee within the giant automotive system that powered the city and the nation. His mother was a homemaker. It was a typical, seemingly unremarkable mid-century American upbringing in a town where conformity was the norm, and ambition often meant simply getting a good job at the plant. But from an early age, it was clear that Richard Knapp harbored dreams that stretched far beyond the factory gates of Flint. He was, by all accounts, a sharp, intelligent, and intensely charismatic young man, blessed with movie star good looks and a natural, undeniable gift for gab. He possessed an energy, a restlessness that couldn't be contained by the predictable rhythms of his hometown. He was also, perhaps, acutely aware of the perceived limitations of his working-class roots. He saw the world beyond Flint, a world of glamour, excitement, and power, and he felt an intense drive to escape, to reinvent himself, to become someone bigger, someone more significant than just another kid from a factory town. His means of escape, his entry into that other world, came crackling through the airwaves. Like millions of teenagers across America in the late 50s and early 60s, he fell head over heels in love with the new, rebellious, and electrifying sound of rock and roll. But unlike most kids, he didn't just want to listen to it, he wanted to be a part of it. He saw his chance not on the stage holding a guitar, but behind the microphone in a broadcast booth. In the early 1960s, while still a teenager attending Lapeer High School, he landed a job that would change his life. He became a disc jockey at WTAC, one of Flint's most popular top 40 radio stations. This was a pivotal moment, his entry into the seductive world of show business, a world where personality, presentation, and the art of the sell mattered as much, if not more, than mere talent. And it was here, in the charged atmosphere of the radio station, that he made a symbolic and deeply revealing decision that signaled his transformation. Richard Knapp sounded too ordinary, too plain, too much like the kid from the factory town he was so desperate to leave behind. He needed a name that popped, a name with star power, a name that sounded like it belonged on the airwaves alongside Elvis and the Everly Brothers. He shed his old skin. He reinvented himself. He became Terry Knight. It sounded cool, vaguely British, like one of the pop stars he was playing on the radio. It was the first crucial step in the meticulous construction of a carefully crafted public persona, a persona built on ambition, style, charisma, and a relentless drive for attention and control. As a DJ, Terry Knight was an absolute natural. He had the smooth, confident voice, the fast-talking patter, and the innate charisma to connect instantly with the young listeners of Flint and the surrounding blue-collar communities of mid-Michigan. He quickly became one of the most popular and influential radio personalities in the region, the hip, trusted voice that brought the sounds of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the burgeoning Motown scene exploding just down the road in Detroit, and countless other hits into their cars, bedrooms, and lives. His show on WTAC and later on its competitor WTRX was essential listening, the soundtrack to a generation coming of age in the industrial heartland. But being a successful DJ wasn't just about spinning records and charming listeners. It was also about access and education. His position gave him the invaluable chance to meet and interview the rock stars who passed through Flint on tour. He rubbed shoulders with record company executives, promoters, and other industry players. He wasn't just an observer, he was a student. He watched, he listened, and he learned the intricate, often cynical mechanics of manufacturing fame. He learned about the art of promotion, about crafting an image, about building a buzz, about creating excitement out of thin air. He learned how to sell not just a song, but an idea, a feeling, a movement. This was his real education, an invaluable real-world apprenticeship in the often brutal realities of the music business. He absorbed lessons he would later apply with ruthless efficiency to his own career, and eventually to the careers of the bands he would manage. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else from his background, the power of hype, the critical importance of image, and the deep, almost tribal connection between a rock band and its audience, especially a working-class audience, like the one he knew so intimately in Flint. He wasn't just playing their music, he was learning their language, understanding their desires, and figuring out how to give them exactly what they wanted, even before they knew they wanted it. The seeds of the promotional genius and the ruthless controller were being sown. By the mid-1960s, Terry Knight was the undisputed king of the Flint radio scene, a local celebrity with regional influence. But the confines of the broadcast booth were proving too small for his burgeoning ambition. He had seen the power and the glory of the rock stars he interviewed. He wanted more than just playing their records. He wanted to make the records. He wanted to be on the other side of the microphone. He wanted to be the star. In 1965, leveraging his significant local fame, his undeniable charisma, and his growing network of industry connections, he decided to make the leap. He put down the headphones and picked up a microphone. He decided to form his own band. He knew exactly where to look for talent. The Flint and wider Michigan area had a thriving, fiercely competitive garage rock scene, filled with raw, energetic young musicians inspired by the British invasion and the gritty sounds coming out of Detroit. Knight, with his DJ's ear for a hit and his promoter's eye for talent, handpicked some of the best young players from this scene. Among them were two exceptionally raw, powerful musicians who would become central and ultimately adversarial figures in his story, a hard-hitting powerhouse drummer with boundless energy named Don Brewer, and a charismatic bluesy guitarist and soulful singer named Mark Farner. With Knight himself stepping out from behind the DJ console to take center stage as the band's suave lead vocalist and frontman, they initially called themselves the Pack. They were a tight, energetic, and undeniably commercial band, perfectly attuned to the exciting sounds of the mid-60s. Their music was a potent, radio-ready blend of British invasion pop infectiousness, American garage rock grit, blue-eyed soul, and Knight's own smooth, polished, professional-sounding vocals. Knight wasn't just the singer. He was the band's undisputed leader, its driving force, its manager, its producer, its chief promoter, and its primary songwriter. He was already displaying the fierce ambition and the almost obsessive need for absolute control that would define his later career. He quickly secured them a deal with Lucky 11 Records, a local label distributed by the larger Cameo Parkway Records based in Philadelphia. In 1966, now billed as Terry Knight and the Pack, they released their debut album. The album spawned a massive regional hit, a dramatic, soulful cover of the Benny King ballad. Knight's powerful, emotive vocal performance was undeniable, and the song resonated strongly with audiences across the Midwest. It climbed the national charts, peaking at number 46 on the Billboard Hot 100, and became a massive regional hit. Suddenly, Terry Knight wasn't just a local DJ anymore. He was a bona fide recording artist, a rock and roll star, at least within the influential boundaries of the Midwest music scene. Terry Knight and the Pack became one of the biggest bands in Michigan, drawing huge crowds to their energetic live shows, and earning Knight a reputation as a charismatic garage idol, a local hero who had made it big. He was learning in real time the complex business of building a band, creating a hit record, managing finances, booking tours, and navigating the often treacherous waters of the music industry. He was doing it all himself, a one-man music mogul in the making. In 1967, always looking for the next angle, the next way to elevate the band's profile, Knight traveled to London. It was the absolute height of the swinging 60s, the epicenter of the music and fashion world. While there, seeking inspiration or perhaps just soaking up the atmosphere, he wrote and recorded a solo single for Capitol Records, a moody, atmospheric, slightly psychedelic song called St. Paul. The song, released under his own name later that year, was a minor hit, but it became unintentionally embroiled in one of the strangest and most enduring conspiracy theories in rock history, the infamous Paul is dead phenomenon. Obsessive fans, already dissecting Beatles lyrics and album covers for hidden clues, seized upon Knight's cryptic lyrics and mysterious backward messages embedded in the recording. They became convinced that St. Paul contained definitive proof confirming the wild rumor that Paul McCartney had died and been replaced by a look-alike. Knight always vehemently denied any intentional connection to the conspiracy, claiming the song was simply about his own feelings of disillusionment and creative searching after his London trip. But the controversy, however accidental, only added to his growing mystique and notoriety. He was learning that even negative attention could be manipulated into publicity. Despite the regional success, the top 40 hit, and the bizarre brush with Beatlemania, Terry Knight and the Pack's momentum began to stall by late 1967. Their second album, Reflections, failed to make a significant impact on the charts. Musical tastes were changing rapidly once again. The simple, catchy sounds of mid-60s garage rock were giving way to the heavier, more complex and more experimental sounds of psychedelia and early hard rock. Internal tensions within the band began to mount. There were disagreements about musical direction, Knight perhaps leaning towards more polished pop, while Brewer and Farner were drawn to heavier sounds. And Knight's increasingly autocratic leadership style, his insistence on controlling every aspect of the band's career, began to chafe against the growing ambitions of his bandmates. By 1968, Terry Knight and the Pack had dissolved, another promising band succumbing to shifting trends and clashing egos. Terry Knight, the former DJ turned rock star turned band leader, found himself once again at a crossroads. His moment in the spotlight seemed to be definitively over. He was approaching his late 20s, an age that felt ancient in the youth-obsessed music world of the late 60s. But his ambition remained undimmed. He had tasted real success. He had learned the intricate workings of the music business from the inside out, and he was absolutely determined to get back to the top. He just needed a new vehicle, a new sound, something louder, heavier, and more powerful than anything he had done before. And he knew exactly where to find the raw, high-octane fuel for his next creation. The breakup of Terry Knight and the Pack in 1968 could easily have marked the end of Terry Knight's significant involvement in the music industry. He could have retreated back to radio or leveraged his connections into a comfortable industry job. But Knight was not built for comfort or retreat. For him, the end of the Pack was merely the end of a chapter, a necessary clearing of the decks before embarking on his next and far grander act. He still possessed the ferocious ambition, the invaluable industry connections, and, crucially, the lingering loyalty of the two most powerful musical components of his former band, the thunderous, powerhouse drummer Don Brewer and the raw, bluesy, intensely charismatic guitarist and singer Mark Farner. Brewer and Farner, though perhaps weary of Knight's controlling nature, still believed in his vision, or at the very least in his undeniable ability to make things happen, to open doors that remained closed to mere musicians. And Knight in turn saw in them the raw, untapped potential for something truly massive. He sensed the shifting tides in rock music. The psychedelic dream was fading, and a hunger for something heavier, more direct and more primal, was growing. He envisioned a new kind of band, a stripped-down, high-energy power trio. He saw a band that would take the heavy, blues-based foundation laid by British giants like Cream and Led Zeppelin, but would inject it with the raw, unpretentious, working-class energy of their Flint, Michigan roots. It would be music for the factory workers, the heartland kids, the disenfranchised masses who felt left behind by the peace and love counterculture. It would be loud, simple, and utterly crushing. He convinced Brewer and Farner to join him in this new venture. They needed a bassist, someone who could provide the seismic low-end foundation for their high-volume assault. They found their man in Mel Shacker, a thunderous, fuzzed-out bass player from another popular Michigan band, the equally eccentrically named Question Mark and the Mysterians. Shacker's aggressive driving style was the perfect fit. The chemistry between the three musicians was immediate and explosive. Brewer's powerful metronomic drumming, Shacker's distorted, earth-moving bass lines, and Farner's raw, bluesy guitar riffs and soulful, almost frantic vocals created a sound that was incredibly loud, incredibly simple, and incredibly effective. It was primal. It was visceral. It felt less like composed music and more like a force of nature. Knight made a crucial career-defining decision at this point. He would not be the frontman this time. His brief, relatively unsuccessful stint as a rock star was definitively over. He recognized, with a clarity born perhaps of disappointment, that his true talent, his real power, lay not on the stage, but behind the scenes. He would be their manager, but he would be far more than just a manager in the traditional sense. He would be their producer, their promoter, their chief strategist, their image consultant, their Svengali. He would be the architect, the puppet master, the absolute controller of their entire career. And he gave them a name that perfectly captured their heavy sound, their working class origins, and his own grand ambition, Grand Funk Railroad, a clever, powerful play on the famous Grand Trunk Western Railroad line that was a lifeline through their home state of Michigan. Knight moved with the speed and decisiveness of a military general launching a campaign. He knew that in the crowded rock landscape of 1969, they needed to make a massive, immediate impact. He used his industry connections and considerable promotional savvy to secure the band a seemingly impossible slot, performing for free at the massive Atlanta Pop Festival in July 1969. It was an enormous gamble. Grand Funk Railroad was a completely unknown band, essentially crashing a party filled with established superstars like Led Zeppelin, Janis Joplin, and Creedence Clearwater Revival. They weren't even listed on the official posters, but Knight knew how to manufacture a buzz. He orchestrated a relentless guerrilla-style promotional campaign in the weeks leading up to the festival, plastering Atlanta with posters, buying up local radio ads, and generating a sense of mystery and intense anticipation around this unknown band from Michigan. He wasn't just booking a gig, he was staging an event. When Grand Funk Railroad finally hit the massive stage in Atlanta under the hot Georgia sun, they played with the ferocious, desperate energy of a band that knew this was their one and only shot. Their performance was a raw, high-volume, stripped-down assault. Just three guys, often shirtless, playing as loud and as hard as humanly possible. It was a stark, almost brutal contrast to the more nuanced, psychedelic, and often indulgent sounds of many of the other acts on the bill. And the massive crowd, estimated at over 100,000 people, went absolutely, unequivocally wild. They responded to the band's raw power, their unpretentious energy, their sheer, overwhelming volume. Grand Funk received a thunderous, sustained ovation, the kind usually reserved for headliners. The audience demanded encores. In a single explosive 45-minute performance, they had gone from total unknowns to the undisputed sensation of the entire festival. Backstage, record company executives were reportedly scrambling, checkbooks in hand, desperate to sign the band that had seemingly come out of nowhere. Terry Knight, the master manipulator, had pulled off his first and perhaps greatest promotional coup. He quickly signed the band to Capitol Records, the label that had released his own St. Paul single just a few years earlier, securing a deal that gave him an unprecedented level of control. And he made another crucial, controversial, and ultimately fateful decision. He insisted on producing their albums himself. This was almost unheard of at the time. Managers managed, producers produced. But Knight wanted, demanded, total control over every aspect of their recorded sound. He understood exactly what he wanted, a raw, loud, unpolished sound that captured the visceral energy of their live shows, a sound that bypassed the studio trickery and sonic sophistication favored by many producers. And he believed, perhaps correctly at the time, that only he could deliver it. Their debut album, On Time, was recorded quickly and cheaply and released in August 1969, just 1 month after their triumphant Atlanta debut. The album was a raw, unadorned slab of heavy blues-based rock. It was primitive, it was powerful, it was almost crude in its directness, and it connected instantly and massively with a huge audience of young, predominantly white, working-class rock fans across America. These were kids who felt alienated by the perceived intellectualism and hippie idealism of the fading psychedelic counterculture. They just wanted loud, hard, simple rock and roll, and Grand Funk Railroad delivered it in spades. On Time stormed up the charts, quickly achieving gold status certified by the RIAA. Knight kept the pressure on, employing a relentless, almost brutal strategy of constant touring and rapid-fire album releases, flooding the market and building an unstoppable momentum. Just 4 months later, in December 1969, their second album, the self-titled Grand Funk, was unleashed. It was even heavier, rawer, and more successful than the first, also quickly achieving gold status. In 1970, they released Closer to Home, an album that showcased a slight but noticeable growth in musical sophistication, particularly on the epic string-laden title track, which became a major radio hit. The album became their biggest success yet, breaking into the Billboard Top 10 and eventually going double platinum. Grand Funk Railroad, in just over 1 year of existence, had become one of the biggest selling, most popular rock bands in America. And Terry Knight, the visionary, the promoter, the producer, the controller, was the undisputed architect of their astonishing, almost unbelievable success. Terry Knight wasn't just a manager and producer in the traditional sense. He was a master promoter, a P.T. Barnum of rock and roll, a man who understood the power of image and narrative, perhaps even better than he understood music. He grasped something fundamental about the specific audience he was targeting: the young, white, working-class kids of Middle America, the kids in the factory towns like Flint, the kids who bought the albums and filled the arenas. He knew they felt ignored, misunderstood, and often condescended to by the coastal elites, the counterculture establishment, and, most especially, the powerful rock critics who dominated the pages of influential magazines like Rolling Stone. And he brilliantly, ruthlessly used this deep-seated feeling of resentment to forge an incredibly powerful, almost cult-like bond between the band and their fans. From the very beginning, Grand Funk Railroad was savaged, almost universally, by the rock press. Critics lined up to deride their music as simplistic, derivative, Neanderthal, and lacking any artistic merit whatsoever. They were dismissed as corporate hype, a manufactured phenomenon pushed by a Svengali manager, a band that was popular despite being terrible. Rolling Stone magazine, the self-appointed arbiter of cool in the rock world, seemed to take a particular, almost perverse pleasure in attacking them at every opportunity, publishing scathing reviews and dismissive articles. But Terry Knight, in a stroke of counterintuitive promotional genius, turned this critical hostility into his greatest weapon. He didn't try to fight the critics. He embraced their negativity. He famously reprinted the most vicious reviews in full-page advertisements for the band's albums and concerts. He created and relentlessly pushed a simple, powerful us versus them narrative. Grand Funk Railroad, the honest, hard-working, unpretentious blue-collar band of the people, versus the snobby, intellectual, out-of-touch rock critics who just didn't get it. He marketed them not just as a band, but as a populist movement, a cultural phenomenon. He understood that telling their fans that the elites hated their favorite band would only make them love the band more fiercely, more loyally. He spent enormous, almost unprecedented sums of money on massive promotional campaigns designed to bypass the critical establishment and speak directly to the fans. The most legendary example was the colossal $100,000 billboard erected in New York's Times Square to promote the Closer to Home album in 1970, an unprecedented sum for the time, equivalent to nearly $750,000 today. It was an audacious, in-your-face statement of their massive success, a declaration of war against the critics, paid for by the band's enormous record sales. Knight also largely bypassed traditional radio promotion, which was often controlled by gatekeepers who shared the critics' disdain for the band. Instead, he focused on relentless touring, building their audience from the ground up, city by city, arena by arena. He understood that Grand Funk's true power lay in their connection with their live audience. The strategy worked with astonishing effectiveness. The more the critics hated them, the more albums they sold, the bigger the arenas they filled. Buying a Grand Funk album or attending a Grand Funk concert became an act of defiance, a badge of honor, a way for their legions of fans to give the middle finger to the cultural establishment that looked down on them. Terry Knight had brilliantly tapped into a powerful undercurrent of class resentment and cultural alienation and turned it into multi-platinum sales and stadium-filling devotion. He also understood the raw power of spectacle, even in its most stripped-down form. Grand Funk concerts were legendary events, known for their sheer overwhelming volume and the almost religious fervor of their audience. The shows were relatively simple affairs, devoid of the theatricality or complex stagecraft employed by many of their contemporaries. It was just three guys on stage, Farner, often shirtless, a primal rock god, playing as loud and as hard as they possibly could for 2 hours straight. It was a communal experience, a tribal gathering, a deafening celebration of raw, unadulterated rock and roll power. The absolute zenith of this phenomenon, the moment that cemented Grand Funk Railroad's status as the undisputed kings of American arena rock, came on July 9, 1971. Terry Knight booked the band to play Shea Stadium in New York City. This was hallowed ground, the site of the Beatles' legendary groundbreaking concert just 6 years earlier. It was an incredibly audacious move for a band so reviled by the critical establishment. It was a direct challenge, a declaration that they belonged in the same league as the most iconic bands in the world. The tickets went on sale. The music industry held its breath. And then, the impossible happened. In just 72 hours, the entire stadium, over 55,000 seats, was completely sold out. They had achieved this feat even faster than the Beatles had. It was an astonishing, undeniable display of their massive, grassroots popularity. A moment that sent shockwaves through the music industry and silenced, at least temporarily, their harshest critics. Terry Knight, the ambitious kid from Flint, had orchestrated one of the biggest triumphs in rock and roll history. He stood atop his empire, seemingly invincible. While masterminding the Grand Funk juggernaut, Knight's ambition and energy seemed boundless. He somehow found the time to apply his successful formula elsewhere. Spotting another vein of heavy blues-based rock, he signed the band Blood Rock, hailing from Texas, to Capitol Records. He took them under his wing, producing their albums with the same raw, heavy aesthetic he applied to Grand Funk. In 1971, his instincts paid off once again. Blood Rock scored a massive and deeply morbid hit single with the song DOA, a chilling first-person narrative account of dying after a plane crash. The song, despite its grim subject matter, or perhaps because of it, reached the top 40, giving Knight another major production success and further solidifying his reputation as a man who understood the pulse of the American heartland. In just 3 short, explosive years, Terry Knight had achieved a level of success and power that was almost unprecedented in the music industry. He had taken an unknown bar band from his hometown and turned them into the biggest commercial force in American rock music. He had produced a string of multi-platinum albums, 8 gold or platinum albums in total between Grand Funk and Blood Rock in that period. He had conquered the critics by weaponizing their own disdain. He was living the ultimate rock and roll dream, a self-made mogul who had rewritten the rules of the game. But the dream was built on a foundation of absolute, unwavering control, and that foundation, under the immense pressure of success, ego, and money, was about to crack wide open. The very thing that had fueled Grand Funk Railroad's meteoric rise, Terry Knight's absolute, iron-fisted, micromanaging control over every single aspect of their career, was also the insidious seed that would ultimately tear them apart. By 1972, The seemingly unbreakable bond between Knight and the band he had meticulously created was beginning to fracture under the pressure of money, ego, creative frustration, and years of simmering resentment. The members of Grand Funk, Mark Farner, Don Brewer, and Mel Shacker, were no longer the naive, grateful kids from Flint who had placed their futures entirely in Knight's hands. They were now international rock stars, seasoned veterans of the arena circuit, multi-millionaires who were beginning to seriously question the terms of their relationship with their manager, producer, and undeniable controller. Money was the primary and perhaps inevitable point of contention. Knight, in his carefully constructed dual role as both manager and producer, was taking an enormous percentage of the band's earnings, a cut far exceeding the industry standard. His contracts, drafted early in their career when they had little leverage or understanding, were notoriously complex, deliberately opaque, and heavily weighted in his favor. The band members began to feel that they were being systematically exploited, that the man who had undoubtedly built their career was now reaping a grossly unfair share of the immense financial rewards their hard work generated. Whispers and rumors began to circulate, never fully proven but persistent, that Knight was using the band's money for questionable personal investments, further fueling their distrust. There were also growing creative tensions. The band members, particularly the primary songwriter Mark Farner, wanted more input into their music, into the production of their albums. They were growing tired of Knight's often autocratic control in the studio. His insistence on maintaining the raw, unpolished sound that had become their trademark, even as they felt themselves evolving as musicians. They wanted to experiment, to grow, to perhaps add more nuance and sophistication to their sound. Knight, protective of the successful formula he had created, seemed resistant to change, viewing their artistic aspirations as a threat to their commercial juggernaut. The relationship had become a pressure cooker. Knight, accustomed to absolute authority, likely saw the band's growing assertiveness as ingratitude and betrayal. The band, feeling suffocated and undervalued, saw Knight as a greedy, manipulative tyrant who refused to relinquish control. The brotherhood that had conquered the world together was fracturing from within. The breaking point came in early 1972, shortly after the release of their fifth studio album, the ironically titled E Pluribus Funk. In a move that shocked the music world and sent tremors through the industry, Grand Funk Railroad fired Terry Knight. The band they felt he had created had declared its independence. Knight, a man whose entire identity, his sense of self-worth, was inextricably wrapped up in his control over the band, did not take the dismissal lightly. He responded with incandescent fury. He immediately slapped the band with a staggering $57 million lawsuit, claiming breach of contract and demanding, among other things, ownership of the band's very name and all future earnings. Grand Funk Railroad promptly countersued, alleging fraud, financial mismanagement, and demanding millions in back royalties they claimed Knight had systematically withheld from them. The legal battle that followed was one of the ugliest, most public, and most destructive internecine wars in the history of rock and roll. It dragged on for 2 long, agonizing years, generating lurid headlines in the music press and costing both sides millions upon millions of dollars in legal fees. The fight became deeply, viciously personal, particularly the animosity between Knight and his former star protege, Mark Farner. Bitter accusations were exchanged relentlessly. Knight, using his considerable media savvy, portrayed the band as ungrateful, greedy, drug-addled rock stars who had foolishly betrayed the visionary genius who had made them famous. The band, in turn, painted Knight as a ruthless, Svengali-like manipulator, a tyrant who had stolen their money, stifled their creativity, and treated them like hired hands rather than partners. The conflict reached its nadir, its most public and humiliating moment, during a sold-out Grand Funk concert at the prestigious Madison Square Garden in New York City in 1972. In the middle of their set, under Knight's legal orders obtained just hours before, marshals walked directly onto the stage and began physically seizing the band's amplifiers and equipment as collateral in the ongoing lawsuit. It was a moment of pure, calculated humiliation, a shocking spectacle that laid bare the bitter, irreconcilable enmity between the former partners for the entire world to see. While the legal war raged, Knight, ever the relentless entrepreneur, attempted to launch his own record label, Brown Bag Records. He signed a handful of new artists, including the oddly named Mom's Apple Pie and a group called the Faith Band. He clearly hoped to replicate his Grand Funk success to prove that he, not the musicians, was the true source of the magic. But the magic was gone. None of the acts achieved significant success, and the label quickly folded, another casualty of Knight's destructive legal battle. Finally, in 1974, after years of draining legal maneuvering and public acrimony, a settlement was reached. It was a complex and, for Terry Knight, a financially and professionally devastating resolution. Grand Funk Railroad got to keep their name and the freedom to continue their career. Knight retained the valuable publishing rights to the songs recorded during his tenure, ensuring a continued substantial stream of income from their past hits. But his career as a powerful manager and producer, the career he had built with such ferocious ambition, was effectively over. He had lost his band, his reputation within the industry was severely tarnished, and a significant portion of his fortune had been consumed by legal fees. In a rare moment of public vulnerability and introspection years later, Knight admitted to a journalist, reflecting on the destructive battle that had consumed his life, "Power made me crazy." The empire he had built with such focus and determination had crumbled into dust, consumed by the very forces of control and ambition that he himself had unleashed. He had been effectively removed from the empire he had created. A long, quiet, and profoundly different kind of exile was about to begin. The empire had crumbled. The bitter war with Grand Funk Railroad had left Terry Knight victorious in court on some points, but defeated in the eyes of the industry and perhaps in his own soul. The man who had once graced the covers of magazines as the Svengali of arena rock found himself ostracized, his reputation tarnished, his phone no longer ringing. The power that had driven him had also consumed him. What happens when a king loses his kingdom? For Terry Knight, the next 30 years would be a long, slow, and often mysterious retreat into the shadows. A final act played out far from the roar of the crowd, culminating in a tragedy that no one could have predicted. After the smoke cleared from the bruising legal battle with Grand Funk Railroad, Terry Knight, the man who had once commanded stadiums and graced the covers of rock magazines, effectively vanished from the music industry. The fall from grace was as swift and dramatic as his ascent had been meteoric. He was only in his early 30s, an age when many music executives are just hitting their stride, but his career at the top, the career he had built with such ferocious intensity, was over. The man who had thrived on control, attention, and the roar of the crowd now seemed to crave only one thing: anonymity. The details of Terry Knight's life during the next 3 decades are relatively obscure, marked by long periods of deliberate obscurity and punctuated by occasional, often contradictory, rumors and brief reappearances. What is clear is that he made a conscious, decisive choice to to step away from the music business, the world that had both made him a millionaire and turned him into a pariah. He moved away from the rock and roll epicenters of New York and Los Angeles. Initially, he settled in quieter parts of Connecticut and his home state of Michigan, seeking refuge from the glare of the spotlight he had once so actively courted. Later, he would relocate again, moving to the warmer, more anonymous climes of Arizona and eventually Texas. He seemed to be actively dismantling the larger-than-life Terry Knight persona he had so carefully constructed years before as a young DJ in Flint. Richard Knapp, the engineer's son from the working-class town, was re-emerging, seeking a quieter, simpler existence. One of the most persistent and intriguing rumors surrounding this period adds a darker dimension to his disappearance. According to some sources, including a mention in his 2004 Guardian obituary, Knight, at some point in the mid to late 1970s, entered the federal witness protection program. The story, though entirely unsubstantiated and never confirmed by official sources, suggests his possible involvement, perhaps peripheral or as a witness, in a significant drug-related investigation. The theory posits that he may have testified against former associates, perhaps figures connected to the sometimes murky financial dealings of the music industry or other ventures, in exchange for federal protection and a new, anonymous identity. It's a compelling, almost cinematic possibility, but it remains pure speculation. If true, it would add another dimension to his retreat from public life, painting a picture of a man running not just from his past fame and the wreckage of his career, but from something far more dangerous. Whether based in fact or merely a wild rumor born from his sudden disappearance, the witness protection story speaks volumes about the dramatic, high-stakes, and often turbulent world Knight inhabited during his peak years of power. What is known with more certainty is that he largely turned his back on the music industry that had been his obsession for over a decade. He channeled his formidable energy, sharp intellect, and proven promotional skills into other, less glamorous, and far less public pursuits. He reportedly worked in advertising for a time, leveraging the skills he had honed, creating massive campaigns for Grand Funk Railroad. He dabbled in various small business ventures, seeking financial stability and perhaps a sense of purpose outside the chaotic world he had left behind. For the most part, he lived a relatively quiet, unremarkable middle-class life, the very kind of ordinary existence he had seemed so desperate to escape as an ambitious young man in Flint. He remarried and started a new family. He became a father and eventually a grandfather. The man who had once filled stadiums seemed content, or perhaps resigned, to melt into the anonymity of suburban America. For nearly 2 decades, the name Terry Knight was little more than a fading memory in the annals of rock history, a cautionary tale whispered among industry veterans, a footnote in the ongoing story of Grand Funk Railroad. The band itself continued on without him, achieving even greater mainstream radio-friendly success in the mid-70s with hits like We're an American Band and their cover of The Locomotion before eventually breaking up in 1976. They would undergo various reunions in the decades that followed, further cementing their place in the classic rock canon, always defined by, yet separate from, the man who had first launched them into orbit. The bitter enmity between Knight and his former protégés, particularly the deeply personal animosity with Mark Farner, remained a cold, hard wall of silence. They were two sides of a story, two conflicting narratives of ambition and betrayal that seemed destined never to reconcile. Knight remained a background figure in their story, a powerful but invisible presence whose influence shaped their origins, but whose name was rarely spoken. Then in 1999, after more than 20 years of near total silence and obscurity, Terry Knight briefly, unexpectedly resurfaced. The popular VH1 television documentary series Behind the Music, known for its candid explorations of the dramatic highs and lows of rock stardom, produced an episode dedicated to the turbulent history of Grand Funk Railroad. The producers, seeking to tell the complete story, managed to track Knight down and convinced him to appear on camera to offer his side of the controversial saga for the first time in decades. His appearance was a fascinating, almost jarring glimpse of the man behind the myth. He was older, heavier, his once sharp features softened by time, his face etched with the lines of age and perhaps regret. But the old fire, the fierce intelligence, the sharp wit, and the unapologetic, almost defiant confidence were still unmistakably there. He spoke candidly, if often defensively, about his time with the band, about his controversial management style, his production techniques, and the bitter, protracted split. He maintained his long-held narrative that his actions, however controlling, had always been in the band's best interest, that his autocratic grip was necessary to forge their success in a hostile industry, and that he had been unfairly demonized by the band and the press. He expressed little remorse, projecting an air of a man wronged but ultimately vindicated by the band's enduring success, a success he still clearly saw as his own creation. His participation provided the documentary with its crucial dramatic tension, a reminder of the deep, unhealed wounds that still lingered a quarter century after the split. The Behind the Music episode brought the Grand Funk saga and Terry Knight's name back into the public eye, however briefly. For a moment, it seemed like there might finally be a chance for some kind of reconciliation, a closing of the circle. The passage of time, the perspective gained through age and distance, had perhaps softened some of the old, hard edges of the conflict. According to his daughter, revealed only after Knight's death, this period did indeed see a private internal shift in his perspective. She discovered unsent letters he had written to Mark Farner during the 1990s. In these deeply personal letters, which he ultimately could not bring himself to mail, Knight reportedly expressed a degree of remorse that he had never shown publicly. He acknowledged his own significant role in the conflict, admitting that his ambition had become all-consuming, that he had been too greedy and wanted to control everything. It was a private, unvoiced admission of the very flaws his critics and the band members themselves had always accused him of. It was a heartbreaking glimpse of a man wrestling with his own complicated legacy in the lonely quiet of his self-imposed exile. But a public reconciliation, a handshake between Knight and the band members, never happened. The wall of silence, though perhaps cracked by time and private reflection, remained largely intact. After his brief reappearance on VH1, Terry Knight retreated once more back into his quiet life. His cameo role in the documentary, a fleeting, poignant echo from a bygone, more tumultuous era. The conclusion to Terry Knight's story is marked by shocking, senseless violence, a brutal coda to a life that had been lived in the extremes of fame, fortune, and conflict. By 2004, Knight was living in the relatively small city of Temple, Texas. He was 61 years old, a grandfather, seemingly living a quiet domestic existence far removed from the chaos and dangers of his rock and roll past. He was in a relationship and shared his apartment home with his adult daughter and her young teenage boyfriend. On the night of November 1st, 2004, a violent argument broke out in the apartment. According to police reports and subsequent trial testimony, the dispute was between Knight's daughter and her boyfriend, a teenager named Donald Allen Fair. Terry Knight, hearing the commotion, intervened, attempting to protect his daughter. The argument escalated rapidly and violently. Fair, reportedly high on methamphetamine at the time, retrieved a knife from the kitchen. In the ensuing confrontation, Terry Knight was stabbed multiple times. He died at the scene, on the floor of his own apartment. The man who had once commanded armies of rock fans, who had built and lost a multi-million-dollar empire, who had battled corporate giants in protracted legal wars, who had perhaps even navigated the dangerous underworld suggested by the witness protection rumors, met his end not with rock and roll notoriety, nor quietly in old age, but through a squalid, brutal act of domestic violence. He died allegedly while trying to defend his daughter. It was a brutal, meaningless, and deeply ironic end for a man whose entire life had been defined by a fierce, often ruthless, battle for control. In his final moments, confronting a chaotic, drug-fueled rage, he lost control completely and tragically. Donald Allen Fair was quickly arrested, subsequently convicted of murder, and sentenced to life in prison. The headlines briefly flickered with Terry Knight's name once more, recounting his past glories as a rock mogul, his notorious feud with Grand Funk Railroad, and the shocking, violent circumstances of his death. And then the name Terry Knight faded again, this time forever. Terry Knight's legacy is a complex mixture of brilliance, ambition, and tragedy. He was an undeniable pioneer of the arena rock era, a master at packaging the raw energy of hard rock and selling it to a mass audience. His populist marketing strategies for Grand Funk Railroad, weaponizing critical disdain and relying on a direct fan connection, created a powerful blueprint for the 70s rock explosion. Simultaneously, he defined and embodied the dark side of the archetype of the all-powerful autocratic manager who controlled every aspect from production to finance, believing himself to be the true king. However, Knight's story also serves as a stark warning about the dark side of the American dream. It is a stark illustration of how unchecked ambition and the toxic allure of power can corrupt, isolate, and ultimately destroy. His journey from a working-class kid determined to escape his roots to a millionaire tyrant who lost everything, as he himself admitted, "Power made me crazy," is a chilling reminder. His litigious, fraught relationship with Grand Funk Railroad remains a classic case study of the combustible conflict between artist and manager, posing the eternal question: was he a betrayed visionary genius or a ruthless manipulator who exploited them? Perhaps the most poignant and complex irony of his legacy is his tragic death. The man who had spent his life battling for absolute control died in a moment of selfless chaos, allegedly trying to shield his daughter from violence. It was a final act that revealed the human being behind the ruthless facade. In the end, Terry Knight remains a contradictory figure, both a builder and a destroyer. He helped define the scale and business of rock music, yet is now largely forgotten, an often unacknowledged force in the very machine he created, and a reminder that great success can have devastating consequences.